Hi guys. Okay, so we're going to finish up the second part of the lecture. I was able to record the first part and upload that successfully to YouTube. And then I had to stop, so I apologize. So here's the second part. So this is dealing with the other parts of Leviticus. So I'm going to, again, like I said, look down at my notes. I'm used to interacting with people. And then we'll talk about some of the few interesting cases within Leviticus itself. And again, I encourage you to ask questions in the discussion area. And now that the high holidays are over, Yom Kippur was yesterday, I will be checking the discussion closely on Sunday to see where we're at and start to give everyone grades because I'm about a week behind on that. Okay. So within Leviticus chapters 18 and 20, they're specifically devoted to prohibited sexual relationships. 18 is introduced by a general statement about how the Israelites were to act differently than both the Egyptians and the Canaanites, implying that such forbidden practices were accepted amongst these other people. So although there's little evidence to support this in those other contexts, we still see that there's only specific rituals of I'm sorry. So while there's little evidence to see this in other contexts, the specific prohibitions are addressed to men in the list, and with mostly female relatives of whom they're forbidden from having sexual relations with. So, for example, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 6 literally says, "No man among you shall approach anyone of his own flesh or uncovered nakedness." So it really goes on to be specific that a man cannot have sex with his mother, his sister, his father's wife, his half sister, his stepsister, his aunt, and his daughter in law. Also banned was sex with the sister, daughter, or granddaughter of a sexual partner, or with somebody or a woman who was menstruating. Male homosexual intercourse, we're going to talk about in a few minutes. I just want to wrap this up about heterosexual relationships. So many of the relationships prohibited in Leviticus are reported in biblical narrative. For example, Reuben himself was condemned because he slept with his father Jacob's wife, and that's in Genesis chapter 35, verse 22, and again in chapter 49, verse 4. Some prohibited relationships are not considered reprehensible. So Abraham claimed that Sarah was his half sister as well as his wife, and that's in Genesis 20, verse 12. So don't sleep with your half sister. David's daughter Tamar was willing to marry her half brother Amnon after he raped her. Now, let me repeat that. Tamar, King David's daughter, was raped by her half brother Amnon in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 13. Moses' father Amram was married to his aunt Yocheved, who became Moses' mother, and that's in chapter 6, verse 20. Jacob married both Leah and Rachel, who were both sisters in Genesis 29, verses 21 through 30. So that's not all the prohibitions in Leviticus were always enforced in ancient Israel. For violating sexual taboos, their penalty was expulsion from the communities described in Leviticus 18:29, or in some cases, a variant tradition, death. So we'll talk about that in a second too. Let me talk about same-sex relations because this always gets a lot of comments and questions. So, does the Hebrew Bible prohibit same-sex relations? And Leviticus 18 is the great place to really look at that. So, in the Hebrew Bible, same-sex relations between men, only men are described and discussed here, are prohibited. Chapter 18, verse 22, and chapter 20, verse 13. It says, "You shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It is an abomination." And again in 20, verse 13, "If a man lies with a man as one lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be killed. Their blood is upon them." These two prohibitions seem to be variants, with the death penalty added only with the second prohibition. They occur in the context of other prohibited sexual relations, also called abominations, and for some of which the punishment is death. No clear explanation is given for the prohibitions. Some scholars think it may have to do with a blurring of gender identities. That's up for debate, of course. Well, I'm going to talk about two other issues. One, abomination. Let's think of that. The frequently used term for many violations of divine law, concerning not just sexual activity but topics of ritual, idolatry, falsehoods, and diet. Most modern scholars believe and view the prohibition of same-sex relations between two men not as an absolute but a historic condition. Again, all of it related to ritual and potentially even relegated only among the priests themselves. So, not prohibited outright. Nowhere in the Bible are same sex relations between women mentioned. In fact, it says little else that is not ambiguous about same sex relations, although some have been proposed. So, what I mean is, I'm going to offer you examples where it is possible that there was same sex relationships occurring, that being between David, King David, the Messiah, some like to call them, and his BFF, Jonathan. You can look, please, I encourage you, 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 through 4, and 2 Samuel Chapter 1, verse 26, Ruth and Naomi may have also been lesbian lovers, described in chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. So what we have, the third problem that this text comes to light is a man shall not lie with another man as one lies with a woman. It's an abomination. Well, if they are not having anal intercourse, but in a relationship, does that constitute the same thing? And so that's also up for debate. And there's been a lot of ink spilled on that. And if you want to discuss it further, we can when we get back together on class on Wednesday. The narrative interlude in the case of a blasphemer in Leviticus 24. So I'm now done with that topic. In verses 10 through 23. So there's this interesting account in the aftermath of Leviticus 8 through 10. The only other narrative in Leviticus is a short episode of a blasphemer, and that occurs in chapter 24, verses 10 through verse 23. And it's almost as if it's been inserted in this discussion as a holiness code. A man of mixed Egyptian and Israelite parentage is in a fight with a full Israelite and uses the name God as a curse. For this, he was incarcerated until God himself had passed sentence of death by stoning. So we'll talk about capital punishment in a minute. The divine judgment is followed by a more general pronouncement against blasphemy and a fuller version of the law of Lexis Talionis, eye for eye, which applies to the resident alien as well as the Israelite citizen. So I'll spend the next few minutes talking about capital punishment, then women in Israelite ritual law. So capital punishment. In the biblical law, the penalty for a wide variety of crimes is capital punishment, death, oi, which is divinely decreed. The modern argument that capital punishment is wrong because the fifth commandment states, thou shalt not kill, is both a misrepresentation of this commandment, which refers to premeditated murder, and selective disregard of the repeated use of capital punishment in the Bible. On the other hand, the contrary argument that capital punishment is divinely ordained and should continue to be employed is also flawed. So, to a selective, since few today would apply to all cases that's prescribed in the Bible, such as, you're supposed to commit capital punishment when cursing or striking a parent, violating the Sabbath, prohibited sexual relationships. We are not going to do capital punishment, and it's actually probably doubtful that anybody did capital punishment, even though it's listed in the Bible. The usual method of capital punishment in biblical times was stoning. All members of the community participated, thus instilling a sense of collective responsibility for carrying out the death penalty. According to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 7, the first stones were to be thrown by the accusing witness. Burning is more rarely prescribed and only for a man's sexual relationship with both his wife and his mother. But that's what it describes, and sometimes for sexual promiscuity. Adultery is prohibited not by men. Men can have adulterous relationships. Think of Jacob having 2 wives and 2 concubines, but by women. So that's also something interesting to note. So let me talk about on that women in Israelite ritual and law. In the section on Exodus and Leviticus concerning ritual, it is not surprising that women are mentioned infrequently. Israelite priesthood was patrilineal, meaning it went from father to son, and women had a very insignificant role in that example. We do see that women served at the entrance of the tent of meeting, as described in Exodus 38:8 and 1 Samuel 2:22, and that women were singers and dancers and had a liturgical role to play, but were not required to participate in the 3 pilgrimage holidays or festivals, most likely because of their reproductive functions and domestic roles. What we do hear about women's religious activity is often outside the ritual space controlled by men, but women perform ritual roles celebrating military victories, mourning the dead, and maybe even celebrating first menstruation of daughters. The story of Jephthah's daughter, we have evidence of a women's ritual pilgrimage of a mountain in Judges 11, verse 37 and 40. And women engage in ritual activity in household shrines. We really see Micah's mother consecrating silver to God and commissioning an idol for the family's domestic worship in Judges 17, verse 1 through 6. Just a reminder, there may have been, and Israelites may have worshipped idols at one point in time, even though the Bible is replete with statements against idolatry. We also may have had a pantheon of gods, even though, again, the Bible is monotheistic. All this indicates is that it took 1,000 years to construct the Bible as we have it today, meaning the religion that we have today took 1,000 years to form. The subsidiary status of women in Israelite ritual parallels their subordinate legal status. In Israel's earliest systems, women were generally considered property. I roll my eyes because nobody wants to think of themselves as property. But the 10th commandment lists the neighbor's wife between house and slave and animals as property that are not to be coveted, thereby indicating, as argued by many scholars, that women were considered property. Other laws describe how daughters were under the control of their fathers, who received bride wealth at the time of the marriage from the groom's father, and because a daughter was her father's property, he was permitted to sell her as a slave wife. But if she was seduced before marriage, the seducer was required only to sacrifice a guilt offering and pay nothing. So we see that virginity is held at a very high level. Sexual relations prohibited to Israelite males include a large number that concern women who were under the control of and therefore implicitly the property of another man. This is clear from the formulation, a man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness. So the whole idea is that Israel was a patriarchal society with property passed from father to son, and women could inherit only then in very special circumstances. Women were subordinate, and we see that concerning regulation regarding purity, that even around menstruation, purity that you have to wait 7 days from the end of your cycle. And with the birth of a boy, a woman is considered impure for 7 days with the birth until the boy's circumcision, but after the birth of a girl, she's impure for 14 days. So impurity results from menstruation. I mean, we really see that these laws reflect the ethos of a society that produced them, okay? It's a patriarchal society in which women were under the control of men and could be considered property. Impartial counting Countering this essential patriarchal view is the repeated mention both of father and mother as those who are to be honored. Again, and we see that in the Ten Commandments. So the ethics of Leviticus, despite its many details about sacrifice and purity, and also despite its reinforcement of women as subordinate, Leviticus, like other biblical collections of laws, does include a profound humanitarian ethic. Referencing the Exodus experience invites the Israelites to model the divine action of freeing them. In fact, according to Leviticus, the resident alien, the stranger, is a full member of the community, meaning, how could we translate that to today? Illegal aliens we would consider to be full members of our community. Within the community as well, special attention was to be taken to the poor and the needy. And we find this value that, also in Leviticus, that you're not supposed to take vengeance or bear a grudge against your neighbor, for I am the Lord. Leviticus 19:18. The authors of Leviticus wanted us to love our neighbor and had a wide-ranging view of social justice. The need of care for the Israelite, not to cheat, be fair in everything that we're doing, not to be made a debt slave, and really not to charge interest. So we also see that the primary focus of this rule is to love your neighbor as yourself, and it's an effect that we're supposed to, even according to the author of Leviticus, imitate God in this effect. So that's really what I wanted to say about Leviticus. The other thing in contrast to Levitical law is really the law of Deuteronomy. And the Deuteronomic historian is one who we see throughout other parts of the Bible. So according to 2 Kings, we start to see that this idea of Deuteronomy started to supplant other theologies and other understandings in the Bible. So during and under the time of King Hosea of Judah in 622 BCE, the high priest reportedly stated, and is in 2 Kings 22:8, that the Book of Deuteronomy was found. It's today considered the fifth book of the Torah. And it deals with the words, and it really recaptures the essence of the other parts of the Bible. Could be potentially rewritten Bible, you could argue. It has in it lengthy speeches by Moses, where Moses summarizes early Israelite history, including the promise of the ancestors, the escape from Egypt, the wandering of the wilderness, revelation at Horeb, not Sinai, that's different, and subsequent events. Most of the book, however, is yet another legal collection. Not only do we have a third version of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 6 through 21, but chapters 12 through 26 contain Israelite laws concerning criminal, civil, and religious matters, paralleling and modifying those that we just discussed in Holiness Code and in Exodus as well. So I'm not going to get into the total in depth of it, but I do want to highlight that it's really a causal understanding of life, that if you do something bad, then you'll receive a punishment. If you follow God's rule, though, then you're going to receive a blessing. And if I were to sum up Deuteronomy, that's the core message that I could offer. So I hope that you will continue on with your reading and kind of incorporate this and your reading into your response. So don't forget to, you're reading here, the Jewish Study Bible, and an overall understanding of Deuteronomy and Leviticus.